We are now recording.
Okay, so welcome everyone to the second live session for the ecological dimension. I'm very happy to be co-presenting this with Jacqueline again. So if we look at the objectives of what we're trying to learn in this module, it's really looking at wastewater and ecological sanitation, but also the big picture of how does water fit into the Earth system's cycles. So there are some quite technical approaches to cleaning contaminated wastewater and for dealing with sewage. But at the end of the day, we basically use what we call nature's toolkit, which is based on biomimicry. So as in nature, because there's no waste in nature. And so this is the main lessons that we want to bring across here. But a lot of these design principles are so integrated with the other modules. So you may find that from time to time, some of the images that you see in this particular live session, we will be showing you in other live sessions to highlight different components that are related to that particular model. So to start off with, I'd like to hand over to Jacqueline, because she's really going to emphasize the importance of the hydrological cycle within the Earth system cycles. So the next couple of slides, she's going to run with them. So Jacqueline, are you there? If you want to take over and just prompt me when you want the next slide onwards.
Okay, thank you, Ezio. Hello, everybody. Welcome. I decided to start by looking at the bigger picture because we're moving from what was basically a theoretical introductory module to one which is much more geared towards practice. And that is the practice of being an ecological designer. So before we move on, I'd like to look at some of the development in Earth system science that define the living materials that we're going to be working with. We can call them nature's toolkit. I find that a little bit too technological because in actual fact, they're all living creatures. So maybe we could call them colleagues or symbionts or something like that, but they're not really tools as such. Anyway, I'm always very fond of saying that we're all ecological designers. It's something which is inherent to our human nature, and many other people say it as well. For example, David Holmgren, who is the co-designer of permaculture, is very keen on this notion. And in actual fact, this has been upheld by some recent developments in anthropology, which I'm going to look at first. So they sort of provide the rationale for why we can call ourselves ecological designers. So we are, as a species, ecological engineers. It's our niche as a keystone species, maybe even a hyper keystone species, because throughout our history as hunter-gatherers, we learn to manipulate not only our environment, but also the use of other species. We're not, of course, the only species that do this. For example, ant species milk aphids for their sap in the way that we milk cows. Ant species also garden. They garden fungi. So we're not the only ecological engineers as a species, but we are exceptionally good at it. So first of all, I'd like to look a little bit at the text on the left. I'm not going to read the whole thing out. You can go back to the slides and read it all if you want to. I'm just really going to summarize, and it's a piece from an article in Nature which sums up some of the studies that have been carried out. It's a sort of a literature review of other studies that have been taking place for several years now in the Amazon. The conclusion is that even as long ago as 4,500 years, the hunter-gatherers living there were doing polyculture agroforestry. So what we call a modern food forest these days is actually a very, very old system of growing food. What they did was that they tended to favor species that were producing food edible for humans, and there are more of these plant and tree species available in certain parts of the Amazon that have been studied than there should be if it was completely wild. So the conclusion is that humans were favoring the frequency of these plants by somehow or other planting them or favoring their seeds. There's also quite a lot of evidence as well that hunter-gatherers, even 4,000 years ago, cultivated small areas which they had cleared. They would do that for a few years and then they would move on to allow the forest to recover. There's also quite a lot of evidence that they used fire management and other techniques that gave them an enhanced food security even in times of climate change. And there have been quite a lot of times when the Earth's climate has been changing slowly or cooling or heating up. So obviously our hunter-gatherer ancestors had the nous, the understanding, the know-how to manipulate that environment in order to provide themselves with food security. Later in the Amazon as well, something which is really quite remarkable is the evidence for very widespread cultivation, enhancing the soil to make it very fertile using biochar. And they call this soil now terra preta because it's very black soil and it sequesters a lot of carbon, and there's a lot of discussion about using these techniques again to enrich our soils, to improve fertility, but also to draw down carbon from the atmosphere. But it's nothing new. It's obvious that people in the Amazon knew about this even thousands of years ago. As a species also, we have used other ecological engineers. So for example, a beaver is an ecological engineer as well because they engineer the rivers and provide habitats for other species. They manage the flow of water and everything. And our ancestors have known how to keep the beavers in specific places, which will be helpful to them. We've kept wolves in such a way that the wolves have managed to move on herbivores, such as bison and giraffes, which also are used to fertilize the prairies and the savannas. So, you know, overall, the message really is if our ancestors were ecological engineers, there's no reason why we can't be ecological designers again. We did lose this capacity, it seems, particularly with the introduction of fossil fuels, in which it was just so easy to do certain things so quickly and not to think about the waste. But when we become ecological designers, we work with the principle that Mother Nature works with, which is that there is no such thing as waste. The food for one, the waste from one species is actually food for another. So can we have the next slide, please, Ezio? Thank you. So I'm just going to look very briefly then at the hydrological cycle, because Ezio is going to come back to this again and to stress the central statement made by Janine Benyus from the Biomimicry Institute, which life creates the conditions conducive to life. In the middle, there's this picture of the hydrological cycle, which is a relatively modern one, because in the old ones, and you would still, sometimes you still find the old ones, the hydrological cycle was deemed to be driven by a strictly geophysical process, evaporation. So the theory is, and of course it is true still, that solar radiation causes water molecules in oceans, lakes and rivers to rise and turn into water vapor, and that when the water vapor is cooled down by cool air higher up, that it falls back to the earth as rainfall. So that evaporation is purely the physical laws of the universe, thermodynamics. But as we know now, and many of you might have looked at the video I posted by the climatologist and Earth system scientist Antonio Nobra, we also know that there is a biotic process involved, which is transpiration. So plants, particularly trees, they're vascular, they have vascular bundles inside of them, and they are biotic pumps. So they absorb water through these vascular bundles from the soil, and they send it upwards towards the leaves through their trunk. And in the leaves, they open these tiny holes called stomata in order to breathe. And as they do, the water vapor escapes into the atmosphere. Now, as Nobra points out, a single tree in the tropics can actually pump up 1,000 liters of water a day. And so if you have a lot of trees, that's a lot of water that's actually being sent back into the atmosphere, not through the physical laws, but through biology. So what we can conclude now is that the hydrological cycle is a bio-geophysical process, and that life itself plays a major role in the process of transpiration. So that the hydrological process is evapotranspiration. And you can see that in this diagram quite clearly because it's one of the more recent diagrams. But also often when you talk to climatologists and physicists and people like this, they are still talking just about evaporation. And I think it's up to us as ecological designers to put them right and to start working with the geophysical processes. Of course, healthy soil is really important to the hydrological cycle because the humus, the organic matter in the soil, absorbs the water when it rains and stores it in the soil. And in this way, the water can also filter down into the aquifers, the groundwater, so that it can come back again to earth as springs or from wells. And that's really important as well. As Joe is going to talk about it in a little while, the full and half hydrological cycle. So I think what's important, I put this right at the bottom, is as ecological designers, if we're working with life, we don't need to be to feel that droughts and storms and floods and everything are beyond our control. Actually, they're not. Of course, we will have to upscale it considerably to work on a global level to affect climate change. But even in our local microclimates and in our bioregions, we can do a great deal towards restoring the ecological cycle. So can I have the next slide, please, Ezio? Thank you. Now, the other major aspects of Earth system science that we really have to think about the new developments in microbiology, microorganisms, because they are very responsible for driving the nutrient cycles. And we come back to this waste from one species is the food for another species. That's very clear when we start to work with microbes. Microbiology is making huge leaps forward at the moment. It's quite difficult to keep pace with it. And recently, the entire human microbiome was mapped. In following on from the Human Genome Project, which was quite disappointing to a lot of scientists, because when the human genome was mapped, people really thought that because we really are the top species that we would have oodles and oodles and oodles of genomes, but it was actually discovered that, you know, we only have about 20,000 protein coding genes, which is more or less the same as a fruit fly. So that sort of puts us in our place. Rice has 50,000, for example. So it's obviously not as important in some respects as we might think. But then if you look at the human species differently, and you look at us as the sum of all of the genomes that are on us, the microbial genomes, then something different starts to appear. It's a completely different picture. They've discovered a way of, or they've developed a way of sequencing, it's called batch sequencing, all of the genetic material on the human body. And what they have discovered, quite excitingly, is that if you look at it from this perspective, 90% of the genetic makeup of our bodies is actually not human. It's microbial. Only 10% of it on our bodies and in our bodies is human. So that's all the life that's on us and that's in us. And that makes us something like a multi-species organism or a supraorganism. Very important, because as scientists are starting to discover, though there's a lot of work being carried out on this at the moment, these microorganisms, which are in our guts and on our skin, they are responsible for digestion, for vitamin and enzyme production. They develop and regulate our immune system, our metabolism, and even our brain chemistry. And so, you know, we can't live without them. It's a really symbiotic relationship, and we have co-evolved with these single cell organisms, and they might be single cell organisms, but they're really quite remarkable because they're almost like biochemical factories. They are producers of energies within our cells, really remarkable creatures. And everything has a microbiome. So even aphids and ants and plants and trees, these microorganisms are literally everywhere. In fact, we're probably going to discover that it's the microorganisms that rule the planet. That's one of my favorite jokes. So they are our colleagues. We have to learn to work with them. And I've put another section down on the right-hand side, which is a quotation from Martin Blaser, who was the project director for the Human Microbiome Project, which you can go back and read later in more detail if you want to. Can we move on to the next slide, please? So having had a look at the human microbiome, I now just want to introduce the Earth microbiome, which is an ongoing project. It's going to take a lot of years to take samples. They want to take up to 100,000 samples from all over the planet and to batch sequence them to look at the full range of creatures that are living on this planet that are invisible to us, and that until recently with modern technology we were not able to see. At the bottom I put a link to a talk by Rick Stevens, who's one of the scientists involved in this. It depends very highly on a lot of computer technology, very fast computers. But what we're actually discovering is that these microorganisms, which have co-evolved with us and with all the other living organisms on the planet, work in symbiosis to do a great deal of good. It's not the case, as most of us think, that microorganisms are germs, that they're all pathogens. In fact, the majority of them are benign and actually helpful, and discovering their functions is really quite exciting. For example, I've just put 3 in here. A soil bacteria called Mycobacterium vaccae is known to promote the release of endorphins in the human brain when you come in touch with it, which might be the reason that most gardeners seem to be happy people. Another bacteria is called Bacillus thuringiensis, and it's used very widely by organic gardeners for pest control. And there's this fascinating bacteria which is being investigated at the moment called Pseudomonas syringa, which is usually treated as a plant pathogen, but they are now starting to think that in actual fact it could be a cloud seeder because it has the ability to freeze the water that surrounds it. So that's really quite amazing, and it also means that as designers we can work with all of these organisms. Another really important point at the moment, due to the amount of pollution that is surrounding us everywhere in the post-industrial period, is that bacteria can be used for phytoremediation. That means taking pollutants and toxins out of the soil and passing them to plants that can deal with them by working in symbiosis with the roots of the plants. I put just one little quote there on the right-hand side from a book called A Permaculture Guide to Reed Beds, because what the author here is stressing really is that the waste we're dealing with when we're dealing with wastewater treatment is really food for all the microbes, and we do it by using plants that have a symbiotic relationship with the microbes. So we're dealing not with, as we usually think about wastewater, we usually treat it to remove the pathogens or to make it safe, to make it less harmful. So we're removing the harm. But what we're doing when we're working with symbiotic plants and microbes is something completely different. What we're doing is we're turning waste and toxins into a yield. So it's a bit like farming in that sense. So it's not doing less harm, it's actually doing something very constructive. It's recycling. So that is also then all about the functional cycles, because these plants and these microbes are driving the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the nutrient cycle, and they are recycling all of the waste. And they are, of course, helping with the hydrological cycle, which is where I'm going to hand you over to Ezio, who's going to tell you a lot more about this. And I hope that you really enjoy working with all of these wonderful organisms.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Just to expand on what Jacqueline was saying about the hydrological cycle, I found the work of Victor Schauberger very inspiring when I first came across it a few years ago. And it's the first time I've seen anyone try to unpack the differences between the full hydrological cycle and the half hydrological cycle. So on the left-hand side, you see the full cycle. So just imagine a typical landscape with a bit of a mountain covered in trees next to the sea. So you've got generally the winds blowing over across the sea, over the landmass. You've got evaporation from the sea. And then you've got this phenomena of evapotranspiration, which is the moisture coming out of the leaves of all the trees. And that all goes to form rain clouds, and it all comes down again. But these rain clouds, because the temperature in this environment is fairly moderate, and this is what the forests of the world do, they actually act to moderate climate extremities. So you never have huge thunderstorms over a tropical forest. You have regular thunderstorms at almost precisely the same hour every day, because that's in perfect balance with nature. And let's look at the consequences of that on the sketch below that. when you have this situation of a good ground cover with biomass, lots of tree cover and everything, the temperature of the rainfall is relatively higher than the temperature of the ground. Now, it's called a positive temperature gradient. So what it allows is that the rainfall will then soak into the ground. And as the rainfall soaks in, this is so-called new water that's penetrating the ground, but there's already a lot of moisture in the ground anyway. And because of all the microbes and organisms that are in balance in there, and they hold what we could call relatively older water. So as the new water from the rainfall soaks in, it displaces the older water, which rises and comes up, and it brings all the nutrients and minerals and everything. They attach themselves onto the root hairs of plants, and eventually, through evapotranspiration, you get the redistribution of minerals that the plants pull up. So this is a picture that's in balance with each other. So imagine within the soil, you've got this water exchange of new water coming in and old water being pushed out. So there's a little cycle, closed loop cycle within the soil itself. Now, what happens when we scrape clean all these trees? We log them, or we create big cities, and we change the surface character of the landscape. Well, then we don't get evapotranspiration, sorry. But what you do have instead is the continual evaporation over the ocean, but over the landmass now, whatever moisture is in the soil just gets sucked up. And when the rainfall does come down, it re-evaporates very, very quickly. Now, in this phenomena, what happens is that the surface doesn't have a chance to cool down. It forever heats up. So it leads to a negative temperature gradient. Now, what that means is that the surface is hotter than the falling raindrops. And what happens then is that the water from the raindrops don't penetrate into the soil. So you've got this massive runoff, which causes erosion and takes away all the remaining topsoil and continues to do damage. Now, let's look at what happens inside the soil here. Because you've got this rapid runoff, and because of the negative temperature gradient, the water doesn't penetrate. Because of the hot surface temperature of the landscape, it pulls up the water table or the moisture, and the water table then drops, but all the moisture is pulled up to the surface, and this is where you get all the salts that remain behind. They're not pulled up through the roots of trees or plants or anything, and eventually the soils just become acidic or very alkaline, and they're not in balance anymore. And the other phenomena that happens is you have, because of this rapid evaporation and tremendous heat and more moisture in the atmosphere, the cumulonimbus storm clouds will be larger, and then the consequential downpours will be even worse. So this is where we have extreme droughts, and then we have extreme flooding conditions, and we have large hailstones because of the greater cumulonimbus clouds that develop, and the higher the water gets sucked up here, form raindrops, and comes down as big hailstones. And then you also got rapid runoff on the rain shadow side. And so this is the consequences of denuding the landscape. And with that goes all the microbes in the soil. You start losing all the humus and all the moisture retaining opportunities in the soil. So we need to reflect on these two differences here between the full hydrological cycle and the half hydrological cycle. Just by putting biomass back onto the landscape, we are really trying to do our best to mitigate the ravages of climate change. This slide just really shows you where the water comes from. As we know, about 97% of the water is in the oceans. We were left with 3% of fresh water, 30% of that is in the ground, and the rest is in glaciers, and only a small fraction of that is in the rivers. And then breaking down that 1.2%, how much we've got in forms of lakes and rivers, this is basically the water that's available. It's not much. And of this, we use, on the bottom left-hand side here, 7% of our water consumption goes into agriculture. And as we know, a lot of the high users of irrigation is conventional agriculture. You can see our drinking water is very limited. Household is not too bad, and industry uses a fair amount there. But agriculture, if we can make an impact on becoming water-wise with our agricultural endeavors, then we can save ourselves quite a lot of water there. And we do refer to this as nature's toolkit, but I think the more appropriate name is rather biological resources, because these are our partners in development, after all, and it shows all the range of what nature is working 24/7 for us. They never go on strike, they don't belong to any trade unions, and their best habitat to hang out is in these wonderful root systems of plants. Now, most wetland plants have got long, hairy roots, and this is where they hang out and act as filters to clean up the wastewater. So generally, it's the bacteria and all these microorganisms that hang out in the root system of wetlands that clean up all waste material and effectively clean water. If you think of the forest as the lungs of the planet, then the wetlands, where you find a lot of these plants, are the filters of the planet. And if translated to a human body, the forests are our lungs that we breathe in and out, whereas our kidneys and our livers, our liver and our kidneys rather, are the filters which clean out all waste and recycle all the nutrients back into our bodies. So remember that these biological resources are what we use, and in itself these are a closed loop, because what happens here is that the microorganisms, as they die off, they are eaten by the filtering animals. As these die off, they are eaten by little fish, and in itself this is a nice little closed loop cycle. Now onto some practical examples. So imagine we've got contaminated water. So picture yourself in your home. Every time you open a tap, the water goes down the drain, out of sight, out of mind. When you sit on a loo, it's even worse. But if you've got just a small kitchen sink, or even just a shower, a wash hand basin, that water is generally not that contaminated, and we could basically call that grey water. And grey water is really fairly easy to clean up. All it needs is a bit of a sand and gravel filter. And the example on the sketch on the right-hand side, this is something that I've done at home several times. And this is a plastic 200-litre drum. They come in various sizes. I drilled a hole at the bottom where I put a 40-millimeter pipe, outflow pipe, and I perforated it. Not on the outside, of course. And then I started filling it up. So I put 20-millimeter gravel at the bottom. Then I put a layer of what's called bitumen or geofabric membrane. Imagine a nice blanket, and to literally over the stones. And then I filled all this up with coarse gravel, because I don't want any of the coarse river sand rather to get mixed and mingled within the stones. Then at the top here, I put the same layer of bitumen, and then I put another small layer of 20-millimeter stones. So all the grey water coming out of your kitchen sink or your washing machine goes into this tank. And the reason for these stones is that when the water comes out, this grey water, it doesn't create an indentation. It hits the stones and doesn't erode away. The geofabric membrane makes sure that we don't get any other residue coming through in here, and then this same filter, so all the way the grey water filters through here and eventually comes out this side. And this water I was using regularly to irrigate my garden. So every time we had neighbors upstairs who had a washing machine, every time I heard the washing machine going, I was very happy because I knew my plants would get irrigated automatically. Downstairs, when we were living in this particular flat, we had from our kitchen sink, imagine this being a kitchen sink, the outlet came into the soil where there was the outflow, and I buried it in the soil and I just wrapped it in a Hessian bag of stone. And so the grey water came through here and permeated into the soil and fed our vegetables in the top. So this is how easy you can actually clean up grey water. And if you want to get a little bit more sophisticated, you can put a charcoal filter as another layer at the bottom, and then you could probably drink it. However, if you've got waterborne sanitation, or you go and sit on the loo for a number 2, then it's a different problem. So in this case, ideally, we should use compost toilets, because all we add after our deposit is a handful or 2 of sawdust, ideally, that's rich carbon-based, and mixing with the nitrogen from our offload, it breaks down fairly easy. Another example of a compost toilet that's successfully used in the African rural areas is called an arbor loo. This slideshow has been uploaded onto the additional resources for those of you if you want to have a look. And all it is, it's a hole in the ground done with a concrete ring, and it's about 3/4 of a meter deep, and it's got a temporary little shack built on top of it for a bit of privacy. And when the hole is filled, after your deposit, you throw a couple of handfuls of leaf matter or compost down there. And when it's nearly full, you top it up with the surrounding sand and you plant a fruit tree. So you can almost plan where you want your food forest by moving along your outdoor toilet. Now, this is the ideal case if you're using a compost toilet. However, if you do flush your deposits away, generally it goes into waterborne sanitation or sewage reticulation into the local sewage works, out of sight, out of mind, and that's pretty much a linear system. How can we change that at source? Well, you can put in what's called a biogas digester. So from the toilets, you have what's now called black water, because it's got feces in, and you can't put that through a simple grey water sand filter. It needs a more sophisticated treatment. This is where we bring in the biological resources. So the anaerobic process that happens in a biogas digester attracts bacteria that thrive in an environment without oxygen. So this is anaerobic, and what it produces is methane. It produces a methane gas, which you can siphon off. You can use for cooking, for powering up your geysers, and so forth. And then the outlet tank, as the solids settle, it creates a perfect compost or a green fertilizer that you can use. You can also open the hatch here and put down all your kitchen scraps, your green scraps, of course, and your lawn clippings. Other green waste can also go into your biogas digester. Now, most rural areas that are not connected to the grid have what's called a septic tank here. A septic tank is very similar to a biogas digester, except the biogas digester has got this dome where the gas can actually be collected and be siphoned off. That's the difference. So the biogas digester and the septic tank, basically the solids from the black wastewater settle. And these solids is what the nature's resources munch away over time, and then you can extract those and use them as good compost. But you still have a challenge here. The black water that comes out of here in a septic tank, you can normally put it into what's called a French drain, which percolates into the ground and it dissipates in that manner. However, you can still clean up that black water. Let's see how we do that. So these are these two slides are important concepts to grasp. In fact, the previous one, grey water, very simple to deal with, a typical sand filter. But when you've got black water from your feces, it's a different story. You can clean it up using compost toilets, but if you flush it away, you start off with a biogas digester to deal with the solids. Now, how do you deal with the liquids? This is what you can do.
Yeah, there's a question from Victoria about the pathogens from human excrement. Do you want to answer that, or?
Yeah, the pathogens from human excrements are dealt with here by all the bacteria. The anaerobic bacteria just munches it away. And in pretty much the same way, if you flush it to the main sewage works in your town, they deal with it in that situation. So it's not as if they're going to run away. It's a closed system here, and there's a lot of heat that's generated through the gas. And at a temperature of higher than 55 degrees, constantly over 3 or 4 hours, all pathogens are annihilated. So it's not, these biogas digesters are used all over the place. And where we're currently staying in Italy now, there's a couple of large commercial plants that take in all this biogas or raw material, and they've got huge biogas plants that pipe the gas back into the grid. So it's done on a commercial scale, but you can also introduce these at a small household level, at the smallest scale.
Ezio, we also have another question from Juliet. Why wouldn't you just use composting toilets? It seems easier and more efficient.
Good question, but if you're living in a high-rise block of flats, the authorities might not like you to use a compost toilet there. So it's up to the body corporate if they want to introduce a biogas digester there, which instead of flushing the sewage away, you can do a collective scheme. And
there's also, if you use a compost toilet and you can either compost it, but then you have to compost it up to about 55 degrees and keep it there for a while to make sure that you kill all the pathogens. But also by putting your human manure into a biogas digester, you can actually make the system more productive. So if you just compost what is in your compost toilet, yes, you get very fertile compost that you can use in the garden after you've ensured that you have hot composted it sufficiently to kill all the pathogens. But the biogas digester can be used as part of a longer process. So, for example, you can put your human manure in there. You can therefore get methane for cooking. And then what comes out of the biogas digester is still a sort of it's still actually fertile. So you can drain it off into another system. I will actually post something, a video about this so that you can see it. But you can take the slurry from the biogas digester after you've got the methane, and you can use that, the solids you could use around fruit trees, for example, but you can also add other material for composting to it and water, and eventually run it through a reed bed into a wetland, in which case you will get biomass. You will also clean the water even more, and then you can use it for fertilizer, the irrigation. But we're going on to actually talk about that. But I thought I would make that intervention now, because there is a difference when we're thinking as whole system designers in how can we make the process as productive as possible, so that we don't just get one product. If we can actually get more, it depends on the situation. Okay.
No, Jacqueline, thanks a lot for that input. Also, sometimes we locked into existing systems which are difficult to change. You know, the mentality of a lot of people to still flush their number twos away, we're not going to get away from that. But instead of allowing all that waste to run in a linear system down to the local sewage works, we can nip it through a biogas digester by closing the loop. So we allow the solids to settle, which we'll use as compost, whereas the liquids that flow out, we need to deal with those. And those are dealt with in the next slide. So we've got several solutions. So for example, if you're living in a rural area, or let's just say a peri-urban area, and you've got adequate space around you, you can do what's called a constructed wetland. Now, this is emulating, using biomimicry, what you see in the wetlands in nature. They are the filters that filter out a lot of the water before it goes in the deltas, before it goes out into the ocean. But we emulate that. So the black water comes in on one end, it meanders through this wetland, through all the stone material, interacts with all the bacteria that hang out in the plant roots. By the time it comes out, it's called polished grey water, not really good enough for drinking, but more than adequate for irrigation. Or you can use this water to flush your toilets again. So here you're closing the loop again. If you've got a very tight space and you don't have that much land available to develop a constructed wetland, you can establish what's called a living machine. Now, Findorn in Scotland, the eco-village, they've got this is the photo of their living machine. Not to say that they didn't have adequate space, but I think given the geographics and the innovation at the time, they tested this system, and I think it was amongst the first to be implemented in Europe. They won all sorts of awards for it. And this treats all the sewage for the Findorn community. If you've got a huge amount of space, as in these deep rural areas, then what you can do there is what's called a wetland treatment system. And we'll expand on these in the next couple of slides. The other picture to show you, bottom left-hand side, is if you've got a body of water that's contaminated. So for example, the wastewater that comes out of an abattoir, for example, this is where this design comes from. What do you do with that water? Well, you can clean it, because all you do, you create a couple of floating rafts where the wetland plants hang out, and you allow the interaction of the roots with the wastewater, and you can slowly, as the water meanders around here, you can clean up this water as well. And then that cleaned up, or again, polished grey water goes back into cleaning the waste of the abattoir, the floors, and all sorts of other cleaning. Let's expand on this a little bit. So this is a typical...
Can we actually just now field a couple of more questions before we move on? Because okay. I'm sorry, everyone, I've got a really bad cold, so I'm not breathing very well. Laura wants to know if an arbaloo wouldn't affect the groundwater spreading diseases. Well, yeah, we wouldn't put an arbaloo in a place where the groundwater is close to the surface. That's one consideration of ecological design that's really important, that you take the whole picture, the whole analysis of the site into account when you're making these decisions about what functions to use and what toolkits. Ade also says you can use the gas for cooking. Yes, you can use the gas for cooking. And Rob Wheeler wants to know again how hot the compost has to be to kill the pathogens, and it's 55 degrees centigrade.
Yeah, and thanks, Jacqueline. If you can carry on fielding, prompting me for these questions, because I can't actually see them as I do the slides. So keep on doing that. That's great. That's okay. Just going back to the arbaloo, just to re-emphasize what Jacqueline was saying. If you've got a borehole or a spring protection or a little pond that you've created, obviously you won't go and put a drop an arbaloo quite close to that, especially if it's just uphill of it. So you have to be quite streetwise where you put these. But generally, And the reason why we developed septic tanks, and with their French drain that drains out all the black water, you need a geologist, to actually authorize the installation of a septic tank. And why? Because they look at the soil profiles, and only if there's sufficient percolation in the soils will they allow you to build a septic tank. So the same would apply with an arbor loop. If you're sitting on soil that's basically sand, it'll percolate right through, and who knows what it will contaminate. So you need to be quite streetwise where to put these. Then the compost, this is quite an interesting question, because there's a slide, a handout, I think it's in the module 2, which is the a box-like thermophilic composting system. It's called a hot box system. If you can imagine a cubic meter bin where you put all your compost, including the residue from the compost toilet, the heat that's generated in there, and it must be at least a cubic meter. Any smaller and the magic doesn't happen. Any larger and you get too much of an anaerobic process happening in. So it needs to be sufficiently ventilated, but the temperatures inside there can rise beyond 55 degrees. And according to the World Health Standards, you only need to cook these things naturally above 55 degrees for longer than 3 hours, and no pathogen will survive that. So we know how to deal with the pathogens. And then there was another question, the cooking gas. I want to relate that because it's an interesting example that we used. We'll come up again under the module 4 and 5, but we'll mention it here. A few years ago, I was dealing with the construction of what we called special needs schools. These were for learners that were kind of handicapped physically and mentally, and they needed constant care. So we were building these schools with dormitories and kitchens and central dining and big laundry facilities and so forth. Now, we'd studied a couple of existing schools to see how they operate. And we were horrified by the monthly electricity bill, which was in the range of, in South African rands, was 80,000 rand, which is like the equivalent of 5,000 euro a month just for an electricity bill. And most of that goes through heating of your geysers and cooking. So I instructed the engineers for the new school designs to look at biogas digesters. And initially they were a bit reluctant, but after a couple of meetings of persuasion, they arrived at a meeting very encouragingly, and they said they've done the calculations that the biogas digester, just treating the sewage, not even counting in the kitchen waste and other green stuff from the lawns and all that, is more than adequate to power all the geysers for the dormitories and the big geysers for the laundry. So just by doing that, we could slash the electricity bill by literally 70%. And then they factored in the recycling, the cleaning up of the black water into polished grey water that went back into flushing the toilets. So we would reduce the water consumption and make ourselves less dependent on the municipal mains. All we were doing was closing the loop. So biogas digesters have got a lot of potential, and the gas that was coming out of this was also enough for the cooking gas in the kitchens. And this was for a large school with special needs kids, and we had about 400 kids staying in dormitories there. So it's a fairly large school though. Anyway, going back to how do we deal with the black water? So we've got the solutions here. Constructed wetlands for areas with ample space, living machines for areas with limited space. If you've got a huge amount of space and you want to integrate it within wetlands, you come up with a wetland treatment system. And if you've got a body of water that's polluted, you can do what's called water restorers or lagoon restorers. Let's expand on this a little bit. So this slide here you can see what a cross-section through a living machine looks like. You've got the effluent coming in on the left-hand side here. This is the pre-treatment, which is generally a septic tank or biogas digester. Remember, that takes out the solids. So the solids settle in here, but the liquids are driven through from one tank to another. And all you have on top of the tank is a raft, a floating raft with wetland plants. There you see the roots hanging out underneath, full of microbes and biological resources, munching away all this waste as it goes through from one to the other. And by the time it comes out at the end, you can disinfect it, ozonate it, and you can probably drink it. Or else, if it doesn't go through that process, you can recycle it back to flush the toilets. You can use it for irrigation. You can put it into an estuary or whatever. And then a cross-section through a floating treatment wetland. You can see the floating raft here with the wetland plants and all the roots that hang out underneath. As the wastewater moves through, it interacts with the biological resources that munch it away, and by the time it comes out the other end, it's clean. So this is how, and all we do is push water through from one side to the other, and by the time the water comes out at this end, it's polished water that you can use for irrigation. Here's the example of the wet system. Have a look at this website, Biologic Design. Jay Abrams is the master designer there. He's also, I think he's still a current trustee of the Permaculture Association in the UK. But the challenge here was this cider mill. And the wastewater coming out of the cider mill in the UK was about 3.5 pH, which is very, very acidic. And all they did, they constructed a wetland, emulated a wet system here, a wetland ecological treatment system, where the wastewater meandered around, and by the time it came out in the final pond, the wildlife habitat here was pretty much amazing. And this is a cross-section of what it looked like. You had your foul water, wastewater coming in and moving from one canal to the other. And by the time it got out to the bottom, it was fairly clean. All they did was created these mounds, and then they planted the indigenous habitat. There were a couple of beekeepers that came and put their honey boxes there. There were people that would coppice wood, and then all the birds and the butterflies and biodiversity came back. And look at this amazing feature here, which is essentially a natural sewage works here. This is how biomatrix water that are established at Findorn, some of the examples. There's a typical cross-section of the floating island with the plant habitats and the root system. And this is an example of a canal heavily polluted with sewage. And I seem to remember the statistics of this canal. The population alongside it was about 12,000. It was 800 meters long, and there were about 64 sewer outfall sewers draining into here. This water, you put your toes in there, and I think they would probably disappear. Anyway, they cleaned it up significantly. They created these floating rafts. They populated it with plants. And as the foul water ran down this canal, it engaged with the roots, and where the biological resources were hanging out, and it did an incredible job to clean up this canal, and also created a nice walkway for the locals to amble along. This is what these roots look like when they grow in water, and all the microorganisms and everything hang out in this biofilm. Now, a few years ago, there was a student, one of our students, who came up with a case study proposal. He was in the Otoro Mesa in Texas, and I think who's from Texas amongst our students? Is it Kim? I'm not too sure. But anyway, there's a lot of fracking that's going on in Texas. They're drilling for gas, but it's not the natural drilling, it's the fracking process where they introduce a lot of really foul materials into the substrates and under pressure, and then it's released and out comes the gas, but also all this wastewater, which is basically left lying around in these open ponds, hoping that it all evaporates. And the student came up with an idea of how can we clean that. He wasn't an ecologist, but I just gave him this guideline. I thought, imagine if we could create a wet system where you've got all the fracking waste water which meanders. So this is a plan view. It meanders along these channels. And as it meanders along, it engages with plant habitat that's grown in the green areas. And eventually it moves out into a lagoon where you've got more floating rafts, but this could at least clean it, and you can start using this water to irrigate and restore the natural landscape around here. An added feature of this, we thought, what about if we integrate a bit of microfiltration with the wetlands? Now, the pioneers of the wetland treatment system is John and Nancy Todd, but they recently came and started interacting with Paul Stamets, who's the from Fungi Perfecti. And Paul Stamets is a mushroom head, and he's done some great stuff with using mushrooms to clean up soils, bodies of wastewater, and so forth. So these brown areas here are where you've got almost like a pontoon or a Hessian sacks filled with straw that's inoculated with mycelium, and that can further trap heavy metals and all sorts of other stuff as the water meanders along. Don't worry too much about the technicalities of microfiltration, but this is something that we bring up in Module 3. But look out for a video that we're going to post, which I would encourage you to look at. It's about Paul Stamets. It actually explains how all these systems work. Okay, so that was enough of technical kind of solutions. How do we apply these now? So let's look at these next couple of slides, looking at a whole systems approach for watershed bioregional master planning. So we need to think at this scale in terms of watersheds. Let the watershed determine our planning area. And here's an example of a map of South Africa with all its large watersheds. There are other sub-watersheds within this as well, but every country in the world has got this type of water catchment watershed map. And then the other source of inspiration that came along a few years ago was from Slovakia. And there's some very good researchers there called the waterparadigm.org. I really encourage you to look at their material. And they've done exhaustive studies where they've shown just by changing the character of the landscape, by being able to slow down water and trap it in small ponds, lakes, and so forth, you can encourage the biomass, the plants to grow around it, and you can significantly cool down any environment. So this is a typical heat envelope over a city. But if you start greening the city, because of the hard surfaces that have covered up the landscape, you are able to bring down this increase in temperature. And there's some research that I'm dying to get my hands on about Rio de Janeiro. Apparently, Rio was a huge sprawling city more than 100 years ago, and in a short spate of years, the average temperature became literally unbearable until the city godfathers decided to plant millions of trees. And about 20 years later, the average temperature had dropped by 4 degrees. So it can be done, and it has been done. So this is whole systems approach in a watershed. This is another example of a whole systems approach for a water supply, wastewater treatment, and sanitation. I won't go into too many details here. It's from your handouts, except that we've put in a little dotted blue line here, because what we're trying to show here is that the evapotranspiration from the trees all add to the formation of rain clouds, as well as the natural treatment works, the constructed wetlands. There's also evapotranspiration coming from there that feed the rain clouds. So here's our closed loop system. And another example for a whole systems approach, looking at a whole city. Now, don't be overawed by what you see here. I'm just going to explain the basic fundamentals, which are on the left-hand side. So a few years ago, there was these developers that were looking at developing Harlow North, and they said they wanted to look completely different to Harlow South. Apparently, this is near Stanford Airport, and these are slideshows from the EDE course from Findorn in 2006, where the Findorn folk were actually involved in providing some of this input. And the developer only had one overarching design protocol. They worked out that you could not extract more than the 90 liters per person per day requirement from the aquifers without eroding those aquifers. They worked out that they could only extract about 45 liters per person per day equivalent. So the whole design then was based on where does the other 45 liters come from? And it all came from a closed loop design, from rainwater, recycling the water, from permeable pavings, and so forth. Now, there's a detailed slideshow of this, which we will upload in one of most probably in module 5. So look out for it at that time. But we are introducing it here because the overarching design protocol was based on water. So this is how we can apply whole systems thinking. And then also use whole systems thinking for stormwater management. Those of you who've come across Brock Dolman, I really encourage you to look at his material on YouTube. He's also done a couple of TED Talks, and I think he's the guy that pretty much coined what to do with stormwater. So the typical engineer in a linear system, what do engineers do with stormwater? Well, they pave it, they pipe it, and they pollute it. So it's out of sight, out of mind, the fastest route. And instead of having a closed system through swales and a living landscape where you slow down the water, you spread it, and you sink it. So this is a closed system here. And basically, this is what we're trying to do. If you've got a surface that's covered with litter and mulch, remember from the hydrological cycle, this is a full cycle. It allows full percolation. You recharge the water table. Whereas if you've denuded the landscape and you've got a hard surface, typically in urban areas, you've got a faster runoff. So typical engineers, they'll see this problem and they'll make the water run off even faster. Whereas the ecological designer would try and intervene on this horrid landscape here by at least bringing in a bit of biomass, slowing the water down, spreading it, and sinking it. So these are important principles to apply for stormwater management. It's closing the loop. And this is also given, led to this, not this movement, but this design process called Sustainable Urban Stormwater Management. It's also known as SUDS. It's been around now probably 10 years, and they've applied Brock Dolman's slow it, spread it, and sink it. Here you see the hard surface of most built-up areas. The water rushes off. It doesn't recharge the groundwaters. Whereas look what we can do here. You can have a green roof and some soft landscape around the buildings. Even your car parks can have these grass blocks where you can allow the water to soak in. You can have a water reservoir under the car park, and this is how you invoke a closed loop stormwater design system. Now, this is a classic example Those of you who can try and pronounce it, it's a big city in big river in Seoul, and this river got covered up by this major highway that went through the middle of the city here. So this is before. And then the grandfathers, the city grandfathers decided, let's bring the river back. So they ripped out this this major concrete canyon, you could call it, where all the traffic moved up and down, and reintroduced the river that was in the ground anyway, but it was a subterranean river, in stormwater pipes and everything. They brought this out, they dug it up, and look at the amazing park space that's been created here. This is a green lung through the middle of the city. And here are some other examples of slow it, spread it, and sink it, from living roofs, soft landscaping, slowing water down, spreading it, a rain garden, and also catching it on the sidewalks. And this example here of a swimming pond instead of a swimming pool. So you use the edges of a swimming pool, which you can convert. You put your wetland plants that can filter out your water, and you don't need any more chlorine here anymore. Now, the important thing of a water body next to a house is that it can easily add 10 to 15% value onto your property. Also designed in the right place. The sunlight strikes the water, it bounces off, and it can bring in a lot of light and warmth into a building. It's just a nice landscaping feature. And just two more slides. And this one I like to use because it gave me a lot of inspiration of what to do in a rural area or peri-urban area. So on the left-hand side here, this is the original farm of P.A. Yeoman, who developed the keyline system. And we'll speak a lot more about the keyline system in the next couple of modules, but we're introducing it here because its whole thrust is based on water. So P.A. Yeoman was a retired mining engineer. He bought this farm in Australia, and he was a bit pissed off when he realized that he bought a farm that's unworkable. And he was determined to engineer it. And he studied the contours, the landscape, and he realized he needs to catch the water at the highest source. So he created a whole lot of small little catchment dams where the overflow of one fed the other. And in this manner, he rehydrated the entire landscape. So this is an aerial photograph of his farm. Sadly, though, what happened 40, 50 years later, because he developed this in the late 50s, 60s, suburbia was catching up on this side here. And I believe the farm has been sold now to developers. But at the time, the family had no longer owned this farm. They had sold it off. And Darren Doherty, whose course I did on regenerative agriculture, he showed us this slide where he said, imagine if we convert this farm into a peri-urban suburb, but by developing all the rainwater harvesting on site, what would it look like? And he came up with a little sketch of where the roadways would go, and he worked out that this farm here could house, there was enough water there for 1,200 households, each using 500 kiloliters of water per annum. So it's quite amazing. And I was so inspired by this vision that he had, even though this was just a sketch, that a few years later, myself and some colleagues, we developed a case study for Ndumu in South Africa. This was an area where there was very little rainfall, and this whole town that was being developed here needed, it was a ramshackle town, but the government at the time decided to establish a big school, a clinic, and all sorts of other stuff here and create a regional node. But they were stuck. They needed a 30-kilometer water supply pipeline, which still hasn't been built to this day, to make this town viable. And there was a lot of concerns by professional built environment people, and I got roped into this project where we said, imagine if we could wipe the slate clean here. And we went according to first principles of planning a town based on first principles, looking at what the landscape looked like. So the first thing we do, we plan for water. So we plan, where do we catch water? And here's a saddle dam at the top. There's another saddle dam there. There's a small catchment dams. And the engineer on our team worked out that if we just do this basic design, there's more than enough water for all the residents of the town, so much so that we don't need that 30-kilometer water pipeline. Now, we will expand on this slideshow in the next course, in the next module, sorry, and then again in module 5. And I'll also upload the full presentation of this slideshow, of this case study. But we started off with the rainwater plan. And then we integrated rainwater with access roads, because from the roads you gather a lot of stormwater, and the runoff of stormwater into swales develops the forest belts, and over that we draped over the permaculture zones, and that was our town planning draft layout. But more about this in the next module. And I think this is where we can end it on a technical note, and I'll hand over to my colleague Jacqueline for the final slide, which is very nice. I'll let her read it out here.
As I'm always one who likes to introduce the arts into our work as ecological designers, I thought it would be very nice to end with the beginning of one of William Blake's poetry, which I think is extremely appropriate to the work that we are doing as whole systems designers, because ultimately it's about vision. It's about being able to see the big picture as well as to see the details. It's about being able to see the patterns. In particular, in permaculture, we look at patterns. It's about being able to observe, but it's also very much about imagination and about regarding the natural world as more than just mechanical, but being something quite, being something living and also something which is inspiring. So I hope you liked the poem, and I hope you liked the presentation and you found it useful. Are there any questions?
So thank you very much, Ezio and Jacqueline. We've gone a bit over the hour that we had budgeted for this live session, but it was a very interesting presentation, and thank you for extending it a bit. I think for practical purposes, we'll stop the recording here. I didn't see anybody with a pressing question, but maybe if you do have questions, please don't hesitate to post them in the classroom or send them to Jacqueline or Ezio. They'll be able to clarify your questions. So thank you, everybody.
Thanks,
See you
everyone.
next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.